I'm so delighted that reading through this specific research report, it really reflects what happens now today in between the United States and China. And the main concern, as we all know now, strategic competition between the two superpowers. Currently, at the center of everything is a technology competition. And we are very much onto this specific topic. And even if today, many international students and political studies focusing more onto this technology aspect. So I'm so delighted to have such an important and timely discussion, and together with my two dear colleagues, Professor Hu Yizhong and Professor Yao Hongming, they are also involved in these studies and research very much. So once again, I'd like to thank Carine for playing such a connection and middleman roles, and she has been putting a lot of effort actually connecting not just between MBR, TCSS, and also the French institution in Paris. So I'm so delighted to have such a network. So perhaps this is the time that we can connect with each other and knowing what happens, and also this new progress of research. And I'm pretty sure that there will be some follow-up. And after this discussion, I welcome and also open to everyone, especially interested in doing more. So through the research, this report reflected we are not just looking into what China has already developed. Further down the road, we have to think among us whether there will be an international digital network should be developed after our discussion. So once again, I'd like to thank Carine and also Roy, and also our dear friend Doug, and also other colleagues making this possible. So on behalf of TCSS, I'd like to thank everyone putting tremendous effort for this to be happening. Once again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Liu. I will immediately give the floor to Mr. Kemphausen, if you will.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Carine. As was said, I'm Roy Kemphausen, president of MBR. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you, whether morning in Taiwan or evening here on the U.S. East Coast or late afternoon elsewhere in the U.S. It's a delight to be reconnected with my old friend, Dr. Fuguo Liu, and look forward to hearing from your two colleagues a little bit later in the program as well. And look forward to the opportunity to hopefully see you again in person soon. Should surprise no one who's been through these now over 2 years of virtual events that we're in an increasingly digitized world with access to digital networks and platforms more important than ever before. Indeed, Taiwan is at the forefront of this transformation, is at the core of the critical digital supply chains that underpin all of this digitalization. NBR has long recognized the vital role Taiwan plays in the digital world and has sought to deepen U.S.-Taiwan engagement on these digital topics. We're very pleased in 2019 to welcome Taiwan's digital minister, Audrey Tang, to our NBR DC office for a discussion on cyber, and then virtually in 2020 to welcome Minister Tang back for a discussion on COVID biosurveillance. Amidst this increasing digital connectivity, some governments, however, especially that of the People's Republic of China, are eyeing the digital domain in less collaborative ways. Indeed, they see them as a new space in the contest for geopolitical primacy. This even extends to parts of the domain, such as technical standard setting organizations, that had previously been carefully maintained as purely commercial venues. Put simply, the PRC's vision of the digital domain is incompatible with and poses a direct challenge to that of the world's liberal democracies and market economies, including the United States and Taiwan. To analyze the PRC's strategy to win the competition for the digital order, NBR's Center for Innovation, Trade, and Strategy has just released this new report, China's Digital Ambitions, a Global Strategy to Supplant the Liberal Order. This 7-chapter report is written by 6 different authors who bring to bear their different areas of expertise to understand how the PRC is advancing its digital strategy across various elements of the digital domain. The report covers key facets of China's digital strategy and details how the PRC aims to replace the existing liberal and decentralized digital order with a state-centric one that favors PRC companies, advances state-centric digital governance policies, and poses an existential threat to the security and values of the United States, Taiwan, and other like-minded countries. Ultimately, the PRC sees a digital order that it dominates as the foundation of a new geopolitical order and a guarantor of its leadership over this new order. We're so glad to have the project's principal investigator, Emily de la Bruyere, as well as chapter authors, Dr. Samantha Hoffman and Mr. Nigel Corey, with us here tonight. They've been deeply engaged with the rollout of this report. I think this is our 5th capital city launch event to date, including events in Europe and elsewhere in Asia. Emily, the principal investigator, will provide an overview of the report's central argument and the PRC's digital strategy. Then Samantha will discuss how we should understand the PRC's construction of digital infrastructure. And Nigel will conclude by analyzing the PRC's approach to global data governance. We'll then move into a moderated discussion between Fu Guo, Professors Hu Yuzhong and Yao Honmin of Zhengda. It's going to be a great evening. We look forward to it. Carine, let me turn the mic back to you now.
Thank you, Mr. Kemphausen. Without any further delay, I will introduce our first author speaker, Mrs. Émilie de la Bruyere. Emily is a non-resident fellow at the National Bureau of Asian Research and co-founder of Horizon Advisory, which is a consulting firm focusing on the implication of China's competitive approach to geopolitics. She is the co-editor and author of the introduction chapter titled A New Type of Geopolitical Power, China's Competitive Strategy for Digital Revolution, and of another chapter titled Setting the Standards, Locking in China's Technological Influence. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carine. Sorry. And thank you for having me too. It's a pleasure to be here. As noted, I'm going to start with a broad overview of how in this report we diagnose China's digital ambitions and the implications we see in them, as well as the advantages that those promise China. Very broadly, Beijing has diagnosed that there's a new industrial revolution underway. It's catalyzed by the emergence of data as a new factor of production, alongside land, labor, capital, and technology. In this new industrial revolution, China sees a chance to rewrite the international system and hierarchy rather than just to rise within it. As Beijing sees it, industrial revolutions create reshufflings of the global order. They mean that there is a new strategic determinative resource that can be competed over, and where a new rising power can unseat the incumbent that controls the previous determinative basket of resources. So that's China's ambition here, to compete for the digital revolution by competing for data. And as China sees it, if it can control data, it can control every other factor of production. It can determine how land, labor, capital, and technology are produced, distributed, and consumed. This idea of controlling data exists at a first order in terms of China's efforts to lock in greater access to data than other players have, whether that's by building out an international digital infrastructure that it can access the information on, or by ensuring that it controls its companies such that it can also see into their data. This ability to access superior information promises Beijing a competitive edge in just about every domain, whether that's military or economic or informational, because China can better understand the environment and better target its operations against competitors and to further its goals. But China's digital ambitions don't end at just acquiring better data. They also involve working to try to control data's movement across the board and across domains. So the idea here is that Beijing's trying to shape the information that other users receive, what it is, where it goes, at what pace, and through what. Because if China can do this, it doesn't just get a competitive edge in every battlefield. It also has the ability to shape that battlefield. It can decide what information a commercial competitor is looking at or deny that information. The same goes for a military competitor or an informational competitor, or for populations who are forming their opinions about the global order. If China can do this, it can control the world. And it can dominate militarily without having to deploy troops. It can dominate commercially and technologically, even without the best technology, even without competing for the dominant international currency. And it can shape the information environment in which all of us operate in a way that absolutely determines our proclivities, our incentives, and what we know is the realm of possible within that. China's pursuing this strategy along, as we map it in the report, two main directions. The first is a bottom-up effort to shape the systems of the digital environment. This includes, as Sam is going to talk about, physical infrastructures, because the digital world is built on physical systems, whether those are telecommunications infrastructures or data centers or satellites, to name just a few. At the same time, China is also working to build and deploy virtual infrastructures for the digital world, namely platforms. These are the systems that determine how users interact with the digital environment. They both collect information and disseminate it. And they range from, for example, financial payment platforms to social media platforms to logistics systems. Again, they run across the gamut, and they complement the physical infrastructure in terms of not just providing an actual foothold, but also shaping the digital environment. At the same time, from the top down, Beijing is working to determine what the regulatory and governance and technical standard architecture of the digital environment is, to set international rules, to set international technical standards. If China can do this, it can lock in the kind of informational advantage that it's trying to secure, because it will write the rules for the next generation and in a way that is very difficult to uproot. Throughout this process, we see China benefiting asymmetrically from a set of structural advantages that are very difficult to compete against. Those include primarily China's scale, its centralization, and its industrial capacity. China's big. That means that A, there's more information that it has to begin with, and B, its digital systems are bigger than other digital systems. And this is a competition because of network effects that's largely determined by scale. A digital infrastructure is going to be differentiated by being able to offer users the most connections, more perhaps than it is by having better technology or a better user interface. Moreover, China's centralization allows it actually to leverage this scale in a way that other players cannot. This is evident in, again, China's platforms, for example, being able to compel its own users to use the same platforms. But this is also evident in how China goes about working to shape, for example, international technical standards. China can make sure that its companies, when they go to multilateral standard setting organizations, are all voting the party in line, and therefore have more weight en masse than the more fragmented players of the international liberal ecosystem. And then, of course, there's China's industrial capacity. This industrial capacity lets China influence the international private sector as well as its own, especially because it has secured points of leverage or dependence in digital relevant strategic value chains. This industrial capacity also, quite simply, gives China the tools it needs to build out digital infrastructures and to be relatively independent as it does so that it can, again, exert coercive leverage without having the same kind of leverage exerted on it. Altogether, it's not a happy picture. It's a somewhat terrifying future, and one that, because of China's structural advantages, is very difficult to compete against. As such, as we see it, it demands a coordinated multilateral response, and one that runs the gamut from cooperation on physical systems like value chains and digital infrastructures, and building those, and also building virtual platforms to go with them, but also a coordinated vision of what a liberal order for a digital environment looks like. Getting together as like-minded countries and agreeing on what this regulatory system should be, what its standards should entail, and then how that vision can be promoted such that China's bid to co-opt the international system cannot succeed. And with that framing, I'll turn it over to my colleagues to talk about more concrete details.
Thank you, Emily. I will immediately give the floor to Dr. Samantha Hoffman after introducing her. She is a senior analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. She has been working on both the domestic and global implications of the Chinese Communist Party's approach to state security. And she is the author of the chapter Securing the Foundation, Building the Physical Infrastructure of the Digital World. Dr. Hoffman, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. So my chapter, I was asked to focus on the implications of the expansion of China's digital infrastructure globally. And I think that although there is an increasing global conversation and understanding of the general issues associated with the expansion of this infrastructure globally, oftentimes it still remains a vastly misunderstood and oversimplified problem. So in my chapter, I try to describe a somewhat broader framework for understanding the issue. To start out with, maybe it'll be useful to describe what I mean by digital infrastructure. So the Chinese Party state prioritizes investing and building in new infrastructure, things like 5G and data centers, for instance, and are the types of things that it refers to. And new infrastructure generally refers to infrastructure that enables Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things, and other data-dependent environments such as smart cities. This infrastructure, I think best described as digital infrastructure, refers to the physical hardware and the software that enables digital connectivity. So digital infrastructure at a physical layer could include something like smart cameras, smart cars, and smart appliances, and other IoT sensors and devices that help to support, in their ideal form, real-time decision-making. Technology that enables data storage and data flows, such as 5G, helps to deliver and exchange that information. And artificial intelligence and big data processing help to derive value out of the data. So for instance, fiber optic cables, data centers, and IoT devices enable connectivity in smart cities. All of these facilitate the collection, processing, usage, transfer, and storage of data. And therefore the delivery of a wide range of services on which society is becoming increasingly dependent. Now, when I say that I think that the scope of the problem is ill-defined, in part what I mean is that a lot of the discussion on China's digital ambitions globally has focused on, and particularly the term tech authoritarianism, has focused on the most intrusive uses of technology, such as surveillance technologies, and risks such as espionage as the primary risk of allowing Chinese companies into one's digital ecosystem. However, what my work finds is that essentially any technology, whether it's clearly service providing and the kind of technology that any government would seek to potentially utilize in order to improve the efficiency of service provision, as well as more clearly coercive technologies like surveillance systems, can have a broad range of strategic implications that go beyond surveillance and espionage, essentially, and in that it really is dependent on who has access to or possession of the data that those products generate. So I argue in my chapter that one issue that we need to think more clearly about is the risks associated with not just the end user of a technology and what their intent is, or even the provider of that technology. Oftentimes we focus on, say, Huawei. and other more prominent Chinese tech companies, at the risk of underestimating perhaps the companies whose products are built into their supply chains. And so one example I provide in the chapter is actually an illustration from a paper that I wrote in 2019 called Engineering Global Consent. And in that paper, I described a Central Propaganda Department controlled company called Global Tone Communications Technology, which is engaged in machine translation. In this chapter, I describe, for instance, the export of smart cities systems. One of the things that TTCom provides, according to its own statements about its activities to Huawei, is a translation device that's embedded in part of some of Huawei's smart conferencing solutions, which are offered as part of smart cities packages. For instance, in Malta, the description of the smart cities arrangement that Huawei had included the smart conferencing solution. So essentially what happens is that, at least the logic of this relationship, is that a company like GTCom has their device embedded in Huawei's product. It's not one that the end user necessarily knows is there. And all it's doing in terms of service provision is helping to facilitate real-time translation in a conference call. But for a company that's controlled by the Central Propaganda Department, that includes that enables the ability to improve the accuracy of translations, and it also contributes directly to other objectives that the company has, which it says are linked to state security. So the company says that it aims to improve its ability to automatically generate text, and you can link that to concepts in Chinese research, which are aimed at developing businesses just like GTCom, which can produce auto text or fake news comments under news articles in many different languages. So essentially what this example is by showing that digital infrastructure, part of the risk that we need to be thinking about more broadly is who has access downstream to the data that infrastructure generates. And if we aren't thinking about those risks, then we aren't necessarily thinking about the full extent of the problem. I'm aware I'm running out of time, but there's one other issue that I'd like to cover, which is in my chapter, and it sort of links into the chapter that Emily's written, which is on standard setting. For my chapter, I focused a little bit more on the way that the Chinese party state seeks to develop standards domestically and export them globally through technologies. So I described the technical committees at the central level in China, which are responsible for developing standards for things like facial recognition systems or the database schema for smart cities platforms. These standard settings committees, technical committees, tend to consist of both members or researchers from companies such as Huawei or Hikvision or Dahua, as well as researchers from, say, if you're talking about facial recognition systems, Ministry of Public Security linked research institutes. Now, they develop the standards that companies are expected to meet domestically in China if they're to win local contracts for something like a smart cities facial recognition system or smart cities database platform, rather. And over time, because of these standards, no matter what company is contributing, or wins a bid to provide these technologies, they'll be meeting standards that are set at a central level. Now, these standards are also being exported globally when these products are exported globally through market activity. So it's I guess a methodology, a way of standard setting that is often overlooked in a lot of the conversation about China's role, say in the ITU or other standard settings bodies, is actually that standard setting is also happening through market activity. And although maybe these technologies aren't perfect yet, essentially what's happening is that China's creating buy-in to those standards. And that's something that we should be thinking about. So I think I'll wrap up here, because I think I'm past 10 minutes, and just say that I think in order to better predict and mitigate risk associated with the expansion of Chinese digital technology globally. We need to be thinking a lot more broadly about what risk means. We also need to be thinking about technology and its future trajectory rather than where technology is at today. That requires thinking through how we do, say, due diligence on technology and digital infrastructure. It means better thinking about and accounting for the uncertainties around technology's trajectory or a country's capability to translate concepts into capabilities. So I'll stop there and give time for Nigel to speak now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. I think you're right on time. But I will give the floor immediately to Mr. Nigel Corey, who is Associate Director at the Information Technology Innovation Foundation, where he works on cross-data flows, data governance, intellectual property, and how they relate to digital trade and the broader digital economy. He's the author of the chapter, Writing the Rules, Redefining Norms of Global Digital Governance. Mr. Corey, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. It's really great to be here. Firstly, thanks to the Taiwan Center for Security Studies and the National Bureau of Asian Research for the invitation and arranging for today's event. I think it's a really interesting one that I never get tired of talking about, and I think there's some interesting angles here, especially for Taiwan to consider. So as you mentioned, I wrote the chapter on China's evolving approach to global data governance. Which is really quite interesting because it's still relatively nascent and it is continuing to change, but it's increasingly well articulated and prosecuted at all levels, global, regional, and at the country level. In that, what we've seen in the last 5 years is a change in China shifting from its approach from one that was largely domestically focused in terms of enacting restrictions and controls and industrial digital development supports at home to one that was more balanced and outwardly looking in terms of advocating for its preferred approach to data governance internationally. In particular, China's global data advocacy took an evolutionary step forward with the 2020 launch of the Global Initiative on Data Security, known as GIDS. It's important to recognize that when we're talking about China's approach, that its data strategy is based on the principle of state and cyber sovereignty, where governments can essentially take whatever actions they deem necessary. Because for China, it's about control. China's relatively new cybersecurity law, its personal information protection law, and data security law provide a comprehensive legal framework for data governance in China. And while these laws do address legitimate commercial and privacy issues in China, they provide no effective check on the government's ability to control data or intervene and access data if it so chooses. In analysing China's approach, it's important to highlight that data will naturally flow across borders as part of the global internet, absent artificial barriers and controls, which is exactly what China has been enacting through various laws and regulations over the last 2 decades, most clearly defined or symbolised by the Great Firewall of China. But increasingly, China has become a world leader in another key tool in this toolkit that it's using in forcing firms to only store data locally within the country, a concept known as data localization. It now has dozens of laws and regulations where it forces firms to store data locally, and it makes data transfers illegal or prohibitively complicated and costly. China has expanded local data storage and in many cases local control over data to a growing range of specific data types such as financial, payment, health, genomic, insurance, mapping, scientific and other types of data. And this contrasts with most other countries' approaches in the Asia Pacific as well as the world that accept that the responsibility for privacy, cybersecurity or other issues should flow with the data wherever it's stored. And what's at stake in this battle over the flow of data is nothing less than a central feature of the internet with a significant impact on trade, commerce and innovation, as the free flow of data is crucial to success in today's data-driven economy, which increasingly depends on how effectively firms can leverage data to generate new insights and to unlock value. there are obviously also social and political ramifications. How successful China is in stepping up to the plate and advocating for its approach internationally depends in large part of whether the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Singapore, Australia, and others are in also stepping up their game in countering China's approach and advocating for their own alternative, positive, constructive approach to address some of the underlying legitimate issues as it relates to data. I'll briefly mention a few examples of China's evolving approach to international data governance that I'll go into more detail in the chapter. Firstly, I'll start with, at the highest level, with the multilateral institutions, which China generally tends to favour, especially the United Nations and the International Telecommunications Union, as they provide voting power to governments, thus lending itself to China's focus on state sovereignty. It makes it easier in this way for China to marginalise the private sector and public advocacy groups. The ITU scales even more readily than the UN, as private firms are able to essentially join discussions as sector members, thereby giving them a seat at the table, which means that China can organise a larger delegation of supporters for its various proposals. And China can, as one official I interviewed as a part of this chapter at these organisations, essentially flood the zone in ensuring that it has as many participants and proposals in as many forums as possible. And in this way, it can just push its sort of preferred approach across a range of agendas and meetings and forums in a way that few other countries really can do on a coordinated basis. And so, but at the heart of this, even if the ITU and even the UN don't sort of address the broad scope of data governance and internet governance issues that China wants it to, it's certainly trying to get them to do so in the future in engaging in so-called issue creep around cybercrime and cybersecurity, so that these sort of government-based bodies address the broader range of issues which it wants them to address. And so they're a key forum for China's strategy. But it's much broader. Bilaterally, China's having a direct and indirect impact on many individual countries' domestic development of data governance policies. And we see this happening both directly by the government as part of Belt and Road sort of initiative projects, but also in parallel as Chinese firms such as Tencent Cloud and Ali Cloud are seeking to sort of expand globally into developing countries. And so they're sometimes working in coordination with the Chinese government about sort of enlarging their position in these countries, but also separately, they're seeking sort of market share in these countries around the world. And we've had cases in Indonesia and in India and in Africa whereby these Chinese firms are publicly and explicitly calling for data localization. As a part of an effort to differentiate themselves from US and other foreign cloud providers, as some public officials in these countries have uncertainty about how the cloud firms manage data. And these Chinese firms basically want to say that, hey, if you give this contract to us, or if you allow us to set up here, you won't have any problems from us. We'll give you access to whatever data you want. And so that's obviously a troubling development in that these private firms are out there advocating for policies which sort of further fragment the global internet and sort of essentially extend China-like policies to new countries. But we also have them doing this in Africa in an interesting way, in that there's been a first wave of Chinese-supported infrastructure projects, especially in ICT infrastructure. But we've seen in a few cases like Tanzania and Senegal, whereby the second wave involves these countries considering regulations that are similar to what China has done, including on data localization, as well as also restrictive content moderation / censorship type policies. In terms of trade negotiations, China typically hasn't dealt with data within trade talks, but it recently made some commitments in the context of RCEP. But these are largely meaningless because they weren't legally binding and they're not subject to dispute settlement. China's engaged also in these talks around data in e-commerce negotiations at the World Trade Organization, but these talks haven't advanced enough to actually get to the issue of data governance. And so we haven't yet seen what China's approach to it will be when there's a broader range of countries there. And so it's especially crucial there that the United States, Japan, and others that support an open, rules-based global digital economy maintain their commitment to an ambitious outcome at these WTO talks and not let China and other sort of digital protectionists like Russia water down these types of provisions, which are absolutely central to the global digital economy. I provide a number of recommendations in the report, but I'll leave that perhaps for the Q&A. But I'll just make two specific points here as it relates to Taiwan. One particular interesting development that the US is working on, where Taiwan, or should I say, the member economy of Taipei within the context of APEC can play, is that the United States is involved in an effort to reform the APEC cross-border privacy regime system, which is a privacy-respecting sort of data governance framework in the Asia Pacific. And they're doing this in a way to make it a global data governance framework, which I think would be a really good thing. But they've got to think about how to reform it and potentially take it out of APEC, because APEC also obviously includes China and Russia. And so they're inevitably limited in what they can do within the context of APEC. But they're currently thinking about how they can take CBPR out of APEC. And that would be a really interesting and useful thing for Taiwan to consider and hopefully support. And so the other thing that I'd mention, and it's an issue I advocate to the US officials here, is about the emergence of digital economy agreements, which Singapore, Australia, New Zealand, and others, and as well as the UK, are pursuing. It's, I think, an interesting evolution in what I think countries in the region, in the Asia Pacific, should be considering more broadly. But I'll end it there, and I look forward to the panelists and the respondents and the Q&A that follows. Thanks.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. You are also right on time. It's perfect. So we can start the discussion part of this webinar. And I will leave the floor first to Dr. Liu that I previously introduced. Dr. Liu, if you will, the floor is yours.
Thank you again, Carine. This is really wonderful to listen in person, the presentation by Emily, Samantha, and Nigel just now. This actually, from this research report, covers quite a broader ground. And in the limited time frames, I just want to raise a few points, perhaps in a way to elaborate further, and hope that we can really go into such a brainstorming idea. Number one, I want to mention, in especially Emily's presentation and also the two chapters written, basically reflect such a fundamental structure shift, which really elaborate China is now moving further with its own political system, really different from liberal system. With this centralized political system, supports such a possibility when they can really strengthen its data collection and also turning into political resources in a way domestically they can control a lot of important information, but in the international marketplaces, they can really go beyond lots of private sectors capacity. So this may be something quite stimulating. And I think before people really read through Emily's contribution, perhaps we just note such a Chinese aggressiveness in the international market. But in a way, it also reflects such an important understanding which liberal systems, democratic countries cannot really compete, especially in Taiwan. Our private sectors basically just run their business with the support from the government. But this is just in between the government and private sectors. But while in the different political system, all the companies and the operation would be strongly supported or monitored by the government. So it end up with something quite differently. In our system, we are pursuing for private business interests, but in Chinese system, obviously they are looking not just for the private interests, but they are also looking into national interests behind the scene. So number one question, perhaps I should really reflect the contribution Emily has already done, remarkably stimulating. So the question is, why the system obviously are different in between China and us. So China, in a way, they have already overtaken many countries in the world. And obviously, as Emily also highlighted, Chinese effort may not be stopped for the time being. They will go whatever they are really doing, setting international digital standard and all that. So we have to think in this particular era, how may we all do about it? Because we are thinking that China is now doing a lot more and coming back with such aggressiveness, especially looking into the next generation of industrial revolution. And some of experts in China, and also perhaps Emily also reflected, this may be the time we can call it Industrial Revolution 5 or 5th Industrial Revolution. So thinking of such a possibility, nobody would be able to stop Chinese further effort in the international community. So this may be the first one I want to highlight. So second point, while three presenter also highlighted, Chinese government has already strategized those technology advance, and while many Western countries just leave it to the private sectors, even if some specific country, the United States and Japan, perhaps already set up a higher goal to encourage their industry to go through this digital era. And Taiwan as well, we are also doing the same. But basically, government setting such a higher goal, leaving most of effort to the private sectors. So this would be something I do not know. Perhaps this is a question for three of you. For countries, liberal countries like yourself and also Taiwan, how we might be able to connect further, because in the capitalist theory, basically state and private companies are really separate. Perhaps the policy can stimulate and encourage private sectors to go further. But in this really fierce competition in this new era, digital era, how we might be able to combine these two together, perhaps in a way to encourage private sectors to do more in the sense in the competition. So this may be another difficult question for all of us to ponder further. And I think basically these presentation to me are very stimulating. It is not just reflecting technological information to all of us. It is also combining national security understanding, because for such a long period of time, mostly when we discuss these technological competition or digital era, mostly from these technological background, they may come up with very sophisticated knowledge, but somehow from this report, I really appreciate such a research report. Now, I do not know whether this report is the pioneer one, but at least in the national security studies, it also reflects such an important pioneers' knowledge to all of us, because combining this digital effort with national security. So we need to move in I remember Emily in the first chapter, ending this chapter with something really stimulating, because today's competition is not yesterday's. It is being contested on new battlefield with new tools and to a different end. So obviously, looking down the road in the future, how we might be able to compete with each others. So very importantly, we really need to follow a new guidebook, which we need to really think together. So as Niger concluded with such a stimulating idea, putting into this possibility in APEC, of course, as you just mentioned, APEC, most of the country, China, Russia, are also the members. So how exactly we might be able to go through this multilateral effort and putting things into it without influence by those countries, Russia and China. So perhaps this is something for all of us to think further. But as Nigel just suggested, those countries, Japan, Singapore, Australia, the UK, the United States, and Taiwan, perhaps we have a similar political system and also market system. Perhaps this is some stimulating ideas. We can put all the effort together to develop this digital international network, perhaps in a way to strengthen individual states' capacity to compete. I am not sure if the war from now on will gradually become such a divided war. On the one side, China, Russia may be leading into another dimension of digital war, while the United States and other liberal states may be working on something differently. So perhaps this is the new dimension, as three authors and together with two others also made it quite clearly whether the war from now on will gradually follow different paths and then develop into a divided technological war. This is also something for us, because for now, we may not be able to overwhelm the other different efforts, but at least we can come up with something more competitive. So I will end here. And once again, I'd like to thank the NBR and also three presenters with your wonderful research and also knowledge to stimulate most of us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor. Well, now the challenge for our authors is to remember all the questions and remarks, because we have two more discussions to go. I will now give the floor to Dr. Hu Yuzhong, who is professor at the Department of Computer Science of NCCU, the Dean of the College of Informatics, the director of the Computer Center, and he is also in charge of the Emerging Network Technology Lab. Lately, he has been interested in artificial and machine learning for big data analytics, deep reinforcement learning, information system, and network security. Dr. Hu, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Carine, for your introduction. I'm honored to be invited for this panel discussions, because I'm the only technical people in this forum discussion. So I propose several questions in terms from the technology point of view. The first is the digital definition is quite general. The digital can be applied to data, information, even for the AI algorithm. And so I would like the people to be more specifically related to the concept of digital. Digital can be passive and also can be active. So in terms of the digital, traditional people using like information technology or ICT. So right now, digital probably quite in general. So we must more specifically relate it to each concept. So in terms of the first questions, I'm very interested to know about how the background information or report collected from the speakers, especially from my point of view. We in Taiwan see the network security is a quite important priority strategy in our university, or also in our government. So, but in my viewpoint, I'm from the technical people, so we are just interested in AI algorithm, cryptography algorithm. But from the real essence, we need to see the forest instead of see the trees and bushes. So the first one question is, how do you collect the background information, like a report or also from the web news to become your the background literature review? This is the first question. The second one is, because right now the digital research is kind of a interdisciplinary research. It can be include like a technology, like a policy, like law, or like international relation. So how can you to do the like a vertical integration or horizontal integration of these different disciplines and become like a very solid foundation to do this kind of a research in our future cooperation, especially like AI security is kind of very quite popular or very important emerging technology. And in fact, the countermeasure or adversary AI is quite a very important research topics. So in China, people are also to do this kind of a research, also in American or US or in Taiwan. So we are also very interested to do this kind of a research, especially like a fake news or deepfake, this kind of stuff can be applied to the national strategy to do kind of information warfare. As for the question 3, actually, China had launched a Great Wall of China for 2 decades ago. And China Skynet Sharp Eyes project to do for the smart city and safe city actually is quite an ongoing process. And the China National Social Credit System is also implemented right now. So if the digital Silk Road is kind of a national strategy for China, how can the liberal society or liberal democracy countries can do this kind of a countermeasure in terms of this kind of China strategy, and we can do the countermeasure? Actually, we didn't do this kind of countermeasure. So the reason is why. And also, I'm interested in digital currency. This kind of is also related to the digital. And digital currency, such as a central bank digital currency, is very important, especially it will be related to the future digital economy and digital finance, and also for the payment, etc. So in terms of this issue, I think eventually maybe we can cooperate in this kind of research topic for the digital currency, especially cryptocurrency or stable coins. The capital market is quite huge. Eventually, people will go into this direction, and I think this kind of a very interesting topic will be considered in our future cooperation. And the final one is, because the digital war is an ongoing war or technology war, and so how can the Taiwan play this kind of a pivoting role in terms of like APEC or other community in national community, so we can to do our contribution in a future cooperation? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ho, for your many questions. And we have, or last but not least, one more Taiwanese scholar to discuss the report. It is Dr. Yao Hongming, who is an assistant professor at the Graduate Institute of Strategic Studies of the Taiwan National Defense University. He received his PhD from the Department of International Politics of Aberystwyth University, and holds a master in Science of Management and Information System, which is why his research interests are located in the junction of IR theory, ICT technology, and national security policy. Dr. Yao, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Carine. Thank you for your kind introduction. And I also want to thank MBR and Taiwan Center for Security Studies invitation to the event. My name is Homing Yao. As you know, part of the introduction, my research interest is always about technology and international relations. And today, I'm really happy to hear three very distinguished scholars who have put their effort investigating China's technology strategy. From Emily, she mentioned about, China recognized the need, to catch up, or maybe not to live with him, but, to develop a new strategy, encounter the new industrial revolution. And I guess in the report, you say it's Industrial 4.0. So the approach has been conducted from two ways. One is top-down, so it's more like the virtual platform thing. And another one is bottom-up, like the technical stuff. And then Samantha continued to talk about the technical aspect of the standard setting and involve issues about the facial recognition, artificial recognition, and also I think in the report mentioned about the new IP. And Niger, more like echo to the top-down approach, explained to us, China also focusing on more on the norm setting, try to develop some kind of rules to government to provide some kind of foundation to government overall development of the technological sector. So all of this basically are supporting the main argument that China is rewriting the global technological order. As I remember, we used to talk about internet freedom, but nowadays we are talking about the data localization. And we used to talk about the net neutrality, but now China is talking about cyber sovereignty. So I guess, a lot of readers, when they are reading the paper, they will ask very fundamental questions. What happened to put us in such kind of position? Certainly, China is rewriting the rule, but before that happened, there must be, something else, some other structural issues that allow China to develop this kind of ability. And hence, I want to, maybe just over a little bit of my perspective and kind of also supporting, all your arguments. I think from 2001, China joined the World Trade Organization. The world has a vision, hoping that economy, activity, market economic activity will be able to survive in China somehow, find its own space. But somehow China is still a very strong state dominant, area where, as you mentioned, I think you probably noticed that the, Constitution specify the Chinese Communist Party is only the legitimate party who will be able to provide a leadership for Chinese people. And on top of that, you mentioned, you also recognize they use the intelligence law, cybersecurity law to marry the private sector with the public sector. And most important of all, we tend to see companies, private companies, with the same vision, like they are just companies. But companies in China are different. They are state-owned enterprises, and they are basically like an avatar of the state. And there are private enterprises, but by the Chinese law, many of them need to try and establish, need to have the CCP commissars and to establish some kind of the Chinese Communist Committee. And I think it's among your report, you also mentioned about in many international organizations such as the ITU, the General Secretary, who is under strong Chinese influence. And likewise, for example, Huawei, over Huawei's supervisory board, there is a board member who is actually the Chinese CCP party member, and who is the, kind of the secretary, CCP secretary within the Huawei. And so all of this contributes some kind of the structural issue that make China different from many economic or political systems around the world. And when we invite China into the World Trade Organization, somehow China has been able to exploit the rules, the multilateral rules over by the World Trade Organization. I think in your report you also mentioned about there's a many couple of dispute settlement complaints issued by many other countries to World Trade Organization, from EU, from US for the intellectual property, for the exchange of the publications. And for people in Taiwan, we see we can understand how difficult that could be. For example, I can buy a lot of Chinese publication in simplified Chinese. Simply go online and do the online shopping. But all the Taiwanese publication are banned by China, and they would not be people in China would not be able to purchase them through the internet online economic activities. And I think this is specifically exemplified by I think one particular dispute settlement. I think it's called 363 in your report, and you vividly mentioned about the U.S. actually filed a complaint about the intellectual property right and the copyright issue against China, but somehow, although China was kind of sentenced illegal in such kind of activity, there has been very few little things, improvement have done by China. So all of this created some kind of structure for China to exploit the liberal economic order. And now we are in an even challenging situation. The Belt Road Initiative offers China another opportunity. It has its own overseas market. And you're talking about the data and the netizens, the biggest number of netizens in the world are in China. So China, the domestic literature in China is saying that they need to employ some kind of two circulation strategy to counter the foreign intervention in terms of the technological sector. One is the domestic circulation by using Chinese domestic market. Another one is external circulation by using the Belt and Road Initiative, which has created some kind of alliance for China. So having said that, and over my perspective, I have 4 questions that I want to maybe offer here and to stimulate that discussion. The first question is about, we're talking about technology sector, and many often we understand China is emphasizing the role of the United Nations and the role of the International Telecommunication Union. But if the technological sector is more like a domain within the economic sector, the private sector, should we have a lot of state involvement in this area? And given that ITU is actually a very state-centric organization. So this is probably something that we can think about. The second question is about the, I'm talking about the structural issue, China's exploitation of the World Trade Organization rules. Is there any other things we can do? Simply put this in this way. I know the cross-trade relationships are always troublesome, but at least in the economic domains, both Taiwan and China are the full members of the World Trade Organizations. So the economic domain should be slightly different from political or military aspects. But somehow, as we noticed, I think it was last year when we tried to develop some kind of economic relationship with Lithuania, and China employed some kind of the non-tariff barrier and to influence Lithuania's decision making. So this will be something we need to think about, the wider structure issue. Is there any way we should do more? Is there anything we should do more? And the third question is about, I think it's Samantha talking about the issue related to China's weaponization of the technology. China has been able to develop its own technology and standards in terms of artificial intelligence, facial recognitions, and all of this will feel back to Chinese state's ability to reform its control. So Samantha mentioned about we need to think about the concept of the due diligence. And I'm thinking about that is actually a potential way aspect we should think about. Is there any due diligence we should employ in the future when we are thinking about transferring technology? And the last question is about how to support China to develop its own market economy. We have been talking about China's state control of the private sector, but among them, we still see the positive aspect. Remember Alibaba, who is the sponsor of the South China Morning Post, and who is still quite open to discuss a lot of taboo issue. And I think although Alibaba has been forced by the CCP to establish some kind of the CCP subcommittee within its organization, but still, I'm thinking that when we connect it to the origin of the World Trade Organization, try to promote the Chinese domestic market economy will still offer a potential way forward to reaffirm the liberal economic order we have been talking about as the theme of this talk. And having said that, I think I'm going to conclude my perspective over here, and hopefully I'll be able to continue any kind of dialogue with all the participants here, either publicly or privately. Thank you very much, and back to you, Carine.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yao. Well, we have a lot of questions. It's a great challenge for our authors. Well, I will give back the floor to our authors for follow-up answers, and after that, we will take any questions from the public if there is any. You're welcome to send them over as soon as possible so that I know better how to manage the time left. I don't know if one of the authors would like to start, or I will just designate one. I see that Nigel opened his mic.
I'll start, and then I'll let Samantha and Emily follow on, and I'll sort of answer parts of all the questions that came from each of the respondents, and I appreciate their thoughtful remarks. I think they were very astute in terms of their diagnosis of the challenge that we now face, in that China is a large economy and has a large presence in the global technology sector and in the global digital economy, and how do we as liberal economies deal with that? And I think Dr. Liu sort of like really hit the nail on the head in that, in a way that sort of dovetails with Dr. Yao's sort of comments there at the end, in that there's an evolving recognition about what we all should do next in reaction to what China and Russia are doing in both trade and the digital sector, in that there seems to be a greater push to work between like-minded countries who share values, in that we're seeing this embedding of both values as well as national security concerns within trade and economic arrangements in a way that we haven't really seen before. It was more sort of driven, for the lack of a better phrase, about pure free trade and economic efficiency. We're now seeing the rise of concerns about the values associated with trade, with the national security issues embedded within them, and what opportunities and risks they pose to both production networks and supply chains, as well as obviously associated applications of technologies for whether it's defense industrial purposes or for applications that we've considered sort of to breach human rights. And so that's a challenge for us all now, and in terms of how do we come up with the next generation of economic agreements and forums to work on these issues in a way amongst like-minded economies such that we develop greater alignment in how we approach issues around data and AI and cybersecurity and other new and emerging technologies in a way that sets the United States, Taiwan, Japan, Australia, Singapore and others apart from the digital protectionists and the digital sort of authoritarian approach and model best demonstrated by China and Russia. And so that is a challenge because it's a new type of cooperation that the World Trade Organization is poorly positioned to lead on. And so I think it reflects the fact that it's largely incumbent upon those leading countries that recognize the challenge to step up and to find other sort of countries who are similarly concerned to work with on these issues in terms of developing what comes next. And I think that's what the United States is grappling to do. I think that's in part what it's trying to do with the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework. It's also obviously what Japan, Singapore, Australia, the United Kingdom are doing with their respective engagement on digital economy agreements. Obviously also what they're doing in part through the Quad. But I think more broadly, and I think this relates to Dr. Yao's question about standards, is like it requires countries to think about the development of technology in a way that the state hasn't really had to, and that they could leave it to the private sector to do what they do best, which is innovate and compete and trade, but that the state doesn't necessarily need to directly intervene in that, but it certainly needs to be far better aware of who is developing what technology, how is it being deployed and used, and in ensuring that their sort of respective interests and values are embedded between sort of this largely commercial or private sector approach. Because obviously on the other side, we've seen China take a far more direct role in that same process. And so it's incumbent upon other countries to do likewise to ensure that the private sector can still do what it does best, but ensure that there's these sort of overarching concerns and interests and values are also sort of addressed as the commercial sector does what it does. But I'll end it there, and I'll hand it across to Emily or Samantha to add further comments. But again, really appreciate the really thoughtful responses and questions. I think you're very much on the money, as I'd say, in describing the challenge that we all face in reacting to China's rise in the global economy, especially the global digital economy.
Thank you, Mr. Corey. Emily, I see that you open your mic. Do you want to take over?
Yes, I might jump in really quickly and then hand it over to Samantha. But one of the themes that kept, first of all, thank you for those questions and those comments. And as Nigel said, they were spot on, and I think frame more succinctly than we were able to a lot of the themes that we're trying to elaborate in this report. But one of the points that seemed to recur a lot in the comments was the idea that because of China's system, cooperation with China tends to backfire. And what's the alternative? Like, how can we not cooperate? Engagement, even if it's not outright cooperation. How can we not engage? And if we are to engage, how do we protect that such that it's not counterproductive or undermines us? And I think that the ITU case was instructive for that, because part of the issue up to this point is that engagement hasn't been treated as competitive, because there's been a failure to understand what it is that China is doing. And that is something that at least a fundamental reorientation towards engagement can affect on the part of like-minded countries, to say that we can't change the fact that the world is global, but we need to understand that as we engage with China, we are doing so in a competitive framework. And also, to go to the private sector point, the government cannot control what the private sector does in liberal systems, and that's not going to change. However, there can be regulations on the nature of interaction with certain adversarial players. And that can be done to limit or change the incentives of our private sectors as they interact with China. But there's also, and now finally I'm going to get to the ITU point I wanted to raise, there's a question of looking at the different battlefields of engagement or competition and saying, where do we stand in all of these? Is this a field where China has developed a determinative advantage? And so there is no way to engage competitively in our interest. And if that's the case, how do we get out of this? And the ITU might be a good example of that. It's possible we need to just stop engaging with that or find an alternative. And then in others where there's still a possibility to compete and or there are enduring advantages in those, incline the competition towards them as arenas in which we're not playing from a disadvantage to begin with. And I think taking that framing and doing so multilaterally across the different domains, and then also identifying, so that would be one step towards finding an answer. And the next step would be finding a way to shape the incentives of those non-governmental players, namely the private sector, such that they are incentivized to act in our and their long-term interest, as opposed to the short-term rewards. And I think that's something that liberal governments can still do, even without putting their hands on the wheels and telling companies what to do.
Thank you, Emily. Dr. Hoffman, would you like to have any follow-up answer from the questions and remarks?
Yes, and thank you so much for this very thoughtful questions. I'm going to just focus. I wish I could respond to all of them, but I'll just focus on a few. I think Dr. Hu, you asked about sharp eyes and Skynet and social credit, and in particular how we might be able to develop effective countermeasures to these systems. And I think actually the question that you posed at the beginning, Dr. Yao, in your remarks, helps to frame my response to that first question. You had asked what happened to put us in this position or competition with China, and what has happened to allow China to develop these capabilities. And I think on a somewhat more abstract level, what's happened is that we've failed to take China at its word, and to take seriously a number of indicators about how China sees technology as an important tool in enhancing its efforts to enhance and protect state power. And in particular, my research is focused on that question, and this links into sharp eyes, Skynet, and social credit, from the perspective of how technology is meant to enhance social management in China. And a lot of those conversations, they emerged even in the late 1970s and early 1980s, before much of this technology existed. And I point through previous research to the golden projects in the early 1990s, improving connectivity between government offices, to grid management and grid policing in the early 2000s, that gets you to the point where you start to see the development of sharp eyes and Skynet and social credit. And I think oftentimes we tend to see, or at least the way that the academic and research community approaches these issues, is they tend to look at where China's at today rather than where it's going tomorrow. And all you have to do is look at that trajectory of development over a number of decades to see, well, we need to be thinking about these issues more long term, because even though something like, say, social credit isn't operating in its ideal form today, that doesn't tell us that over a number of years that system's going to evolve. So we need to sort of take seriously the concepts that frame the ideas about how technology might be used. And I think that's often what's overlooked or underestimated. With, in particular, how do we develop countermeasures? I think one framing comment would be to make sure that, going back to what I said in my chapter about understanding the scale of the problem, this is, I think, where it's important to understand that a lot of the technologies involved in both of those projects are also problem solving. And we need to be clear about where the actual risk is, and that's again, being able to understand how data collected from one particular source might contribute to a number of different outputs. Something around traffic management or normal sort of public administration could also contribute to mobilization in a time of crisis, which can include the National Defense Mobilization System. In terms of countermeasures, also, I think another thing we need to be thinking about in democracies in particular is, what problems is digital technology, what problems are we trying to solve? Because oftentimes I think we tend to see technology as a solution without clearly defining the problem and how that's going to solve the problem. And perhaps that's how you create more time in order to effectively respond to what China's doing, is to actually take a step back and decide what it is that we see the technology doing in the first place. The last question I wanted to briefly address is the question around my comment on undue diligence. The way I've been thinking about this in particular is, if you follow the logic of this report, a lot of my research, essentially what we're saying in many respects is that all data is potentially strategically valuable. And so, you know, at what point do you decide what data you need to protect? And what data or what areas, you know, are safer perhaps for cooperation and so on. And I think that what we need to be doing is thinking more clearly about which companies and which activities are more directly linked in to, say, Chinese state security, but with that broader definition of state security, where, you know, something like political mobilization or economic mobilization is also part of that definition. So, you know, identifying those companies and their supply chains and understanding, you know, I guess those issues more broadly, which is quite a difficult task, I recognize, but it is something that we need to do. And so I guess that's my vision for a better form of due diligence on the risks associated with the export of Chinese digital technology globally. I wish I had more time to answer the other questions, but I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Dr. Hoffman. I also wish that we had more time, because I'm facing a huge dilemma. It's already, according to the timetable, the time for closing remarks, but I have so many questions I would like to ask. I don't want to make you all go to bed too late, so my question is, do I ask one question to each of you and then we do closing remarks? Or do you want to do closing remarks right now? I see you nodding, but is it for my first option or my second? Doug, maybe you can help me out here.
I would say go ahead and ask them one last question.
Okay, so one last question for each of you, and I have to choose this wisely because I have so many. Emily, I regret the fact that we couldn't get into more detail to your chapter on the standards. So if for the next few minutes, if you could just choose a few takeaway ideas from your chapter on the standards that you would like the big audience to remember. Maybe give us a global idea of how well China is studying the digital standards and what kind of digital standards those are. For Dr. Hoffman, I remember in your chapter that you say that we cannot consider one Chinese technology to be either good or bad, and that's a huge challenge, and that what makes this topic so complex. So going back to Huawei and its 5G infrastructure, should we completely shut ourselves from Huawei, do you think? Or if yes, why exactly, and what bad could happen? How bad could it be for the countries that actually let Huawei install 5G equipment in their countries? And lastly, for Mr. Corey, you talked a lot about cyber sovereignty and localization of data. Could you go into more details and explain why is it that bad? Why is localization of data so bad for liberal countries? And that's it for me. I don't know if there's one of you that would like to start. We don't have to follow the previous order.
I'm happy to just kick it off. Maybe I'll provide like the Spark Notes bullet pointed framing I have for China's standards ambitions. Effectively, China competes for technical standards, which nation states have not really up to this point, for the most part, seen as an area of geopolitical competition in order to lock in an advantage in technical markets. China does so in large part by marshaling its control over the private sector. Beijing ensures that its companies are on the same page with standards, generally at home as they go out into the international environment, and also in advance of participation in multilateral or bilateral standard setting organizations and conversations. This lets China game the standard setting process. The areas where China has made the most progress to date tend to revolve around where China has significant industrial strength. So telecommunications are the very obvious example here, but we shouldn't underestimate the advances China has made even in other areas and areas where it doesn't have this kind of major lead. And the trend lines really across the board are remarkable in terms of the advances in China's standard setting influence over the past decade. Whether you measure that in terms of leadership positions in technical standards organizations, or presence across the board, or bilateral standard setting mechanisms. One of the other things that's notable, and then I will be done, is the way China manages to use international partners to further its standard setting efforts. This is true when it comes to emerging economies. In many cases, Beijing exerts influence over those to bring them onto its page in its standards agenda. It's also true in terms of more developed economies. Beijing has bilateral standard setting partnerships with a number of developed countries, including the US, including the UK, Germany. And on their surface, those are pretty benign, but what they do is they bring the players onto, it goes back to the cooperation question and the dangers of that. It brings the players onto the same page so that then the standards that risk being advocated for by these other players are risk also being in the interest of China.
Thank you, Emily. Dr. Hoffman or Mr. Corey? Dr. Hoffman?
Sure, thank you. So the question was about, in particular, the idea that maybe Chinese tech companies are neither good nor bad, and you asked specifically about Huawei. So I want to clarify my point, because I think the main argument that I'd like to make is that when we focus specifically on a company such as Huawei, we're oftentimes missing the point that Huawei is one of many actors. So if you just look at the smart cities ecosystem in China alone, there would be over 700 companies by my count that have won contracts to develop various aspects of Chinese smart cities. And so if we take that sort of whack-a-mole approach to identifying companies that could be problematic, it doesn't actually get to the core problems that we're dealing with in China. With China's state security legislation, the espionage law, the cybersecurity law, the more recent data security law that was enacted last year, you see the framework that China's placed around how it intends to exert its control over companies and their activities. And through the standard setting process that I described domestically, and how that filters into the way that innovation takes place in China, those are all ways that China exerts power over any company, not just Huawei. So I would say that no, I wouldn't recommend that any country allow Huawei to construct its 5G network, but also really the point is that we need to be thinking again more broadly about risk, because if there wasn't Huawei, there'll be another company to replace it, and there are many others that again, and he's just sort of giving the example from engineering global consent, that are built into the supply chains of companies that are more visible, that are also problematic. Why demand Huawei give data over in an espionage case when you've got something like the propaganda department also directly benefiting from those products? So it's more of just a point about broadening the way we think about risk.
Thank you so much. Last but not least, Mr. Corey.
And I'll be brief in trying to describe the central importance of data flows to the future of the internet and the global digital economy, and our use of this wonderful digital technology, in that China's approach advocates for sort of creating sort of borders online in a way that hasn't existed, obviously, of the global internet, in that they associate the location of data with control. And they associate the location of data with privacy and data protection in a way that most countries elsewhere around the world don't, because they recognize that legal responsibilities can move with the data, and that this association of localization with data privacy or cybersecurity is really misguided and actually not true. In terms of cybersecurity, what matters are the legal, administrative, and technical controls used to secure data securely, rather than the location of where it is at. In that a secure server in Australia is the same as a secure server in Malaysia. And so that's why the location of data is really sort of redundant in that debate. And so it's a central point of contention, though, because for authoritarian countries, the location of data is obviously critical to other social and political interests, namely political and social control. And so they often couch localization as providing data privacy and cybersecurity when there's more often than not this other sort of unspoken interest. And so you see other similarly sort of authoritarian countries looking to China as a model because they like what the perception of control it gives them in terms of how they've used the location of data as a central foundation for their conceptualization of cyber sovereignty. And so you see this popping up in Pakistan, India, Indonesia even, Vietnam, as well as other countries around the world. And for those of us that believe in an open, rambunctious, trading digital economy, we need to do more to combat that because it undermines some of the enormous social and economic values of the global digital economy. And so that's really important for us to fight against because it sort of undermines the incredible use of this technology, which we're doing right now.
Thank you, Mr. Corey, and all of you for briefly answering those questions. We're only 5 minutes late, so it's not that bad. Now for closing remarks, I will give the floor to Doug Strupp, who is Assistant Director at NBR's Center for Innovation, Trade and Strategy. He was responsible for managing NBR's project on China's digital ambitions and was co-editor of this report. And I would like to thank him a lot for helping co-organizing this event with us. His help has been essential. Doug, it's up to you.
Thank you, Carine. And I want to thank all our audience members for joining tonight and sticking around a few minutes late. And I'll just keep this really brief. I want to thank the Taiwan Center for Security Studies for partnering with us on this event. A core part of this project has been engaging with key stakeholders and audiences abroad as these types of digital issues truly demand a collaborative and cooperative response from multiple stakeholders around the world. I'd also like to thank Emily, Nigel, and Samantha for sharing their research findings tonight. And then lastly, I would also like to thank you, Carine, for doing an excellent job moderating tonight and helping put this together. And then lastly, Dr. Liu, Dr. Hu, and Dr. Yao, your comments were really interesting and led to a fascinating discussion. So thank you all.
Thank you, Doug. And for final remarks, I give the floor back to Dr. Liu.
Thank you so much. I shared very much with Doug. I just look into my watch and suddenly recognize we have gone beyond the original time. And I feel sorry to learn that Emily, Samantha, and Nigel cannot really elaborate more because reading through the research report, actually, all of you have done much more rich substance inside, but in the limited time frame, you may not be able to elaborate more. But I do sense our audience here in Taiwan and also in the United States should have learned tremendously from your presentation, even if just briefly. But I like to set catching up some of the important points. Three of you share with us, and most importantly, looking further down the road, when in the world there is no any optional digital international networks exist other than Chinese one. So perhaps this is something we need to beef up our effort together to drive through. Hopefully we can develop a new one connecting with our liberal economy or liberal states working together. And we have such a sophisticated modern technology developed in Taiwan. We are very much like to connect with all of you. And I thank NBR for connecting with us. And I learned from Roy, this is the fifth global effort after you produce such a rich research report. I hope that we will have more follow-up through these perhaps I should say it, experimental webinar. And I hope there will be more connecting with all of you. And on behalf of my colleagues, I want to thank the three wonderful speakers to date from NBR side. And of course, I also like to thank Doug for coordinating such a wonderful event together. Finally, I'd like to thank Carine for making such a wonderful occasion to connect all of us together. At least I can really see it when I read through the paper. I can see in person Emily, Samantha, and Nigel for such a short presentation, really articulated. Once again, thank you so much for all the effort. I'd like to perhaps connect the final point. I would communicate with old friend Roy thereafter. Thank you so much.
Thank you all. Good night or good day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye. Have a good night.
Roy, see you
night.
later.
All right. Thanks, Fuguo.